The day I came home from the hospital, with nothing but a discharge paper and a car seat, I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes and just stared at the steering wheel. My daughter was 3 days old. I had nowhere to go. Let me back up a little, because that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the end of something that had been quietly falling apart for a long time. I just hadn't wanted to see it. My name is Lee. I was 31 when all of this happened, living in Mississauga, working as a dental hygienist at a clinic on Huron, Ontario. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was, legally, even if he stopped acting like it. His name was Curtis. We'd been together for 6 years, married for 3. We met through mutual friends at a Diwali party in Brampton, which felt like a fun story to tell at dinner parties. We got engaged, we bought a semi-detached on a street lined with old maples, and I thought that was it. I thought I'd figured out the hard part of life. When I found out I was pregnant, Curtis seemed happy. He bought a crib before I'd even told my parents. He painted the nursery a soft sage green because I'd mentioned once, offhand, that I found the color calming. I remember standing in the doorway of that room and thinking, this is a good man, this is going to be a good life. I should have paid more attention to the things I was choosing not to think about. Curtis had a business partner named, I don't even want to give him a name, honestly, but I'll call him his partner. They ran a small property management company together, had about 40 units across Mississauga and Oakville. I didn't know much about the business. Curtis handled all of it, said it was easier that way, said I had enough on my plate with work and the pregnancy. I accepted that. I was tired. I was growing a human being and working 4 days a week, and trying to prep a nursery, and I didn't push back on the things I probably should have pushed back on. The first thing that bothered me, really bothered me, the kind of thing that wakes you up at 3 in the morning, was a phone call I overheard in October. I was 7 months pregnant and I'd come downstairs for water, and Curtis was in the kitchen talking quietly, and I caught only a few words before he heard me and hung up. What I caught was, she doesn't know anything yet and we just need a little more time. I asked him who he was talking to. He said his partner. I asked what I didn't know. He paused just a beat too long and said it was about a property deal he was planning to surprise me with. An investment property he'd been saving for, something to celebrate after the baby came. I wanted to believe that. I almost did. But I started noticing other things after that. Small things. A second phone he didn't acknowledge when it buzzed on the counter. Conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms. A folder on the kitchen desk that disappeared one day without explanation. I told myself I was being paranoid. Pregnancy does things to you. Your brain is running on no sleep and too many hormones and you catastrophize. I told myself that. Then, 2 weeks before my due date, I was in a car accident on the QEW. I don't remember it. Not really. I remember the sound. This horrible flat crack of metal. And then I remember waking up in a hospital bed in Hamilton, with a nurse telling me I'd been rear-ended by a transport truck that failed to stop in construction traffic. They delivered my daughter by emergency C-section. She was in the NICU. She was small but she was breathing. That was the first thing I asked. Is she breathing? The nurse said yes and I started crying so hard I couldn't catch my breath. My parents arrived that evening, my mother, my father. They drove in from their house in Burlington, and I was so relieved to see them. My father held my hand and I could tell he'd been crying in the car. My mother stood at the foot of my bed with her coat still on, and her hands clasped together, and I thought, okay, we're going to get through this. Curtis arrived around 9. He hugged me. He said the right things. He said he was so relieved, so grateful, that he loved me, that he'd been terrified. He sat with me for about 45 minutes, then said he had to make some calls, that he'd be right back. He didn't come back that night. I didn't find out until the next morning when I asked a nurse to call him, and she came back and said there was no answer. I called myself, I texted. Nothing for 3 hours, and then just, tied up with something, will be there soon, give the baby a kiss from me. I was still on IV fluids. I hadn't walked yet. My daughter was in the NICU down the hall, and I was only allowed to go see her twice a day in a wheelchair because of my incision. And my husband was tied up with something. My parents were there though, and I held on to that. They brought me food from home because hospital food made my mother visibly distressed. My dad sat with me and watched the news with the sound off and didn't try to fill the silence, which I appreciated. Then I heard them in the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The door to my room was half open, and they'd stepped just outside to talk, and maybe they thought I was asleep, or maybe they'd forgotten how sound travels in hospitals. But I heard everything. My mother was saying something about the house, about the mortgage. I heard my father say, if they separate, it gets complicated. My mother said something I couldn't make out. Then my father said, "Clearly, we can't take on a baby right now, not with everything going on with the retirement property." My mother said, "She'll figure it out, she always does." I lay there and stared at the ceiling tiles. They were talking about me like I was a logistical problem. Not their daughter who'd been in a car accident 2 weeks before her due date. Not their grandchild in the NICU fighting to gain weight under warming lights. A logistical problem. I didn't say anything when they came back in. I just asked about my daughter, if they'd gone to see her that morning, and my mother said she'd found the NICU a bit overwhelming and hadn't wanted to upset herself. And something in me went very quiet. The next day, I asked them directly. I told them I didn't know what was happening with Curtis, that I needed somewhere to go when I was discharged, that I couldn't go home alone with a newborn after a C-section, not yet, not until I could at least walk properly. I asked if I could stay with them for 2 or 3 weeks, just to get on my feet. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the window. My mother said their guest room was being renovated. They'd started a project in September, new flooring. It wasn't safe. My father said they'd help me find a night nurse, they'd cover the cost, that it would be better for the baby to be in her own home anyway. He said it so gently, so reasonably, that for a moment I almost agreed with him. Then I heard what he was actually saying. "We don't want to do this. We're choosing not to. And we're going to dress it up in practicality so we don't have to feel bad about it." I didn't cry in front of them. I don't know how, but I didn't. I said okay, I'd figure something out. My mother patted my hand and said I was so strong. She'd always admired how capable I was. I think she meant it as a compliment. Curtis finally showed up that afternoon. He sat down and held my hand, and I watched his face and I tried to figure out who he was. He asked about the baby. He said the right things again. He had this habit of always saying the right things. I asked him what was going on with the business. He went very still. I said I wasn't angry, I just needed to know. I told him about the phone call in October, the second phone, the folder that disappeared. I told him I was about to leave the hospital with our daughter, and I needed to know what I was walking into. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said there were some financial difficulties, that he and his partner had made some decisions, like they were just choices between 2 reasonable options, that hadn't worked out, that there was a CA audit coming, that things were complicated. I asked him what complicated meant. He said we might have to sell the house. I asked him when he was going to tell me this. He said he'd been waiting for the right time. My daughter was 4 days old, I had 17 staples in my abdomen, and my husband had been waiting for the right time. I asked him to leave. He looked surprised, genuine surprise, like the request didn't make sense to him. I said it again quietly. "Please leave." And he left. I sat in that room alone and I thought about the fact that I had no plan, no place to go, no idea what was happening with my own finances. I thought about my parents in Burlington, who had a guest room and new flooring and no room for me. I thought about the tiny person down the hall who didn't know any of this yet, who was just working on breathing and gaining weight, who had no idea what kind of situation she'd been born into. And then my great-uncle walked in. I need to explain who my great-uncle is, because he's not a figure I'd ever thought of as someone I'd turn to. He's my grandmother's youngest brother. My great-grandmother on my mother's side had 6 children, and he was the last, and there's a big age gap between him and the rest, so he's only about 15 years older than my mother. His name is Jeffrey, not the flashy name, not the dramatic story. He worked as an engineer for the city of Toronto for 35 years. He retired to a house near Lake Simcoe. He gardens, he makes jam. He is genuinely one of the quietest people I've ever met. He showed up at my hospital room with a thermos of soup, because he'd heard from my mother what had happened and he'd driven 2 hours. He sat down in the chair beside my bed and he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I heard you might need a place to land." I burst into tears in a way I hadn't let myself cry in front of anyone else. He waited until I was done. He poured me soup from the thermos into a little paper cup. He asked how my daughter was doing. I told him what the nurses had said. She was gaining weight, her lungs were strong, she'd probably be discharged in 10 days or so. He nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. Then he said, "You and the baby can come to the house, stay as long as you need. I've got 3 empty bedrooms and a garden, and I am retired, which means I have nothing but time." I asked him if he'd talked to my mother about this. He got a very particular look on his face and said, "No, I didn't ask him to explain that, I didn't need to." Jeffrey drove me home from the hospital 9 days later. My daughter was in her car seat, a tiny, perfect, furious little person who screamed at every red light and fell asleep the second we hit the highway, which I would later learn was her signature move. We drove north while the October trees went orange and red around us. and I watched the city fall away behind me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, which was something close to hope. His house near Barry was everything his personality was: quiet, functional, full of things that had been taken care of. The guest room had a good mattress and a window that looked out over the backyard. He'd already found a second-hand bassinet and set it up without mentioning it to me. Just quietly solved the problem before I arrived. Those first few weeks were hard in the way that new babies are hard. The 2-hour sleep stretches, the feeding challenges, the feeling that you have completely lost the plot of your own life. But Jeffrey made it manageable in ways I couldn't have anticipated. He didn't try to help with the baby in a hovering way. He just handled everything around the baby: meals, groceries, laundry, dishes, so that my entire job was to keep myself and her alive, and he absorbed the rest. We talked in the evenings, in a way I'd never really talked with anyone in my family before. He was direct, and he was kind, and he didn't pretend things weren't what they were. One evening, about a week in, he said, "Your mother called me. She wanted to know when you were coming back to the city." I asked what he said. He said, "I told her when you're ready." I looked at him for a long moment. I asked why he'd come to the hospital that day. I asked what made him drive 2 hours when the people who were supposed to show up hadn't. He was quiet for a bit. Then he said, "Because I know what it's like to be in a hard place and have the people around you decide it's not convenient." He didn't explain further. I didn't ask him to. Some things don't need to be expanded on. He was the one who told me to get a lawyer. He didn't frame it as advice exactly. He just said, one morning over coffee, "Do you have someone handling your side of things?" And when I said I hadn't thought about it yet, he said, "You should, before any decisions get made without you." I found a family lawyer through the Law Society referral service. A woman in Barry who specialized in separation and family property. When I laid out the situation, she asked me a lot of questions I didn't have answers to. And then she explained what that meant. She said that in Ontario, matrimonial property is divided based on what you bring in and what you accumulate together. But that if there were business debts, that would affect the picture. She told me not to sign anything. She said those exact words. "Do not sign anything until we've looked at it." It turned out there was a lot to look at. The CRA audit that Curtis had described as complicated was in fact extremely serious. His partner had been inflating expense claims for property maintenance and pocketing the difference. They'd been doing it for at least 2 years. Curtis claimed he hadn't known. I genuinely didn't know what to believe. His partner was the one who handled the bookkeeping. That part was true. But Curtis had signed documents. He had a responsibility to know. The lawyer said the business liability was being investigated. She said our joint accounts needed to be protected. She said several things that made my stomach drop one after another, like stepping on stairs in the dark and finding each one lower than you expected. My parents called during all of this. My mother, mostly. She called to ask how the baby was, which I answered. She called to suggest I should probably think about coming home soon, which I deflected. She called to tell me my father had spoken to Curtis and that Curtis was really trying, that he was going through a hard time too, that maybe I should hear him out. I listened to that one in silence and then I said, "Mom, I'm going to call you back." And I didn't call her back that day. There was one phone call that I didn't expect. My father called me, separately from my mother, which was unusual. They typically called together or she called alone. He called on a Wednesday evening and I almost didn't pick up. But I did. He said, "I want to apologize." I didn't say anything. I was so surprised I couldn't form a response. He said he'd been thinking about what happened in the hospital, that he'd handled it badly, that he and my mother had been preoccupied with their own concerns and they'd made a choice that, looking back, he wasn't proud of. He didn't make excuses, he didn't add a but. He just said, "I'm sorry. You needed us and we weren't there." I cried. I told him it had hurt more than I knew how to say. He said he knew. We stayed on the phone for a while without saying much. And when we hung up I felt something loosen a little in my chest. Not all the way, not like it was fixed but loosened. My mother took longer. She is someone who has always had difficulty being wrong, not because she's cruel, but because she's afraid. When she finally said something real to me, it was in February, when she visited Jeffrey's house and held my daughter for the first time and started crying without warning. She said, "I don't know why I do that. I don't know why I make everything harder," and that was enough. I didn't need a full accounting. I just needed her to see it. The investigation into the business took most of the winter. Curtis's partner was ultimately charged. Tax evasion, fraudulent misrepresentation, several other things that I learned enough about to understand the severity, and then tried very hard to stop thinking about. Curtis was interviewed extensively. He was not charged. But the lawyer said that didn't mean he was without fault under family law. The investigation established that his partner had been siphoning money while the business operated at a paper loss, which meant that the debts that had threatened to take our house were partially, at least, manufactured. The situation was still complicated, but it was less catastrophic than it had looked in October. My lawyer helped me understand what I was entitled to. We negotiated. There were months of back and forth, of documents I read at Jeffrey's kitchen table after my daughter went to sleep, of phone calls I took in the backyard so I didn't wake her. It was exhausting in the specific way that prolonged stress is exhausting. Not dramatic, just grinding. Curtis and I separated formally in March. He was not a monster. That's something I've had to sit with. He made serious mistakes. He kept things from me. He prioritized the business and his partner's version of events over my right to know what was happening in my own life. But he was not a monster. Some situations don't have a villain so much as a collection of failures, and I think that's true here. We divided things as fairly as we could. I kept the house, or rather, the equity from it, once it sold, and used it to start over. I stayed at Jeffrey's house until May. By then my daughter was 7 months old and sitting up on her own, which she did with the same serious concentration she applied to everything. Jeffrey had taken to calling her the supervisor because of the way she watched whatever was happening in a room. He'd built her a wooden toy box. I'd come downstairs one Saturday to find him in the garage with his tools, just quietly solving a problem I hadn't asked him to solve. The morning I left, he made breakfast and we sat at his kitchen table in the early light. My daughter was in her high chair working through a piece of toast. We didn't talk much. He is not a man who fills silence for the sake of it, and I've grown to love that about him. When I was loading the car, he handed me a card. Inside he'd written, in his small engineer's handwriting, "You did the hard thing, now go do the next thing." I drive back to Lake Simcoe a lot. About once a month, sometimes more. My daughter is 2 now, and she has strong opinions about the color of her sippy cup and which songs play in the car, and she calls Jeffrey Papa Jeff, which he accepts with great dignity and no comment. My parents and I have rebuilt something. It's different from what it was before, which I think is probably right. My father has become more present than he's ever been. He's the kind of grandfather who shows up, who gets down on the floor and plays. My mother and I are still finding our way, but she's trying, and I believe her when she tries. I think about what would have happened if Jeffrey hadn't walked through that hospital room door. If I'd gone home to the house on the Maple Line Street, alone with a newborn and a husband who had already started disappearing. If I'd tried to figure all of it out by myself in a situation I didn't fully understand. The truth is I might have managed. I am capable. My mother wasn't wrong about that, but I would have been so much more alone in it. There's a version of family that you're given, the people you're born to, the structure you grow up in, and then there's the version you discover when that first version fails you. Sometimes the person who shows up is who you expected. Sometimes it's the quiet great-uncle who gardens and makes jam and drove 2 hours with a thermos of soup because he heard you might need a place to land. Sometimes family is just the person who shows up. I don't know what it cost Jeffrey to open his house like that, to rearrange his retired life around a grieving 31-year-old and her newborn daughter for 7 months. I don't think he'd want me to make too much of it. He would say he had the room and the time and it wasn't complicated. But I know that it was, and I know that he chose it anyway. My daughter is going to grow up knowing who Jeffrey is, not just as Papa Jeff who gives her toast and lets her hand him tools in the garage, but as the story of what it means when you show up for someone. I'm going to tell her this story when she's old enough to understand it, because I think it's the most important thing I know. That love is not about what you say when things are easy. It's about who drives 2 hours when things are hard. And it's about the people who, even when everyone else has made their choice, make a different one.